It's a real pleasure to review a book that has been a favourite of mine maybe for 45 years in the matter of the King James Bible and modern versions. A book that for me settled the issue way back, but I'll say more about that when I come to a conclusion. I'm going to give you a review for a little while, and it's maybe longer than many of them because of the value of it and the importance perhaps of giving you a little bit more data than usual. The book is called The Revision Revised, and it was written by John William Burgon, who at the time of writing was a Dean of Chichester in southern part of England, and he's an Anglican man. I think he was High Church. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with all of his theology, but having read him much, I'm sure he was a saved man, and most importantly a man with a great love for the Word of God, and in particular the King James Bible. In 1881, the Revised Version was published in England. There were two bodies that were sort of, I don't know what you'd call them, governing bodies perhaps in the Church of England, the Northern Convocation and the Southern Convocation, as they were called. I think the Northern Convocation was in York and the Southern Convocation in Canterbury. And both sides of that church, or both of those bodies, did not agree that there should be a translation. I think it was a Southern Convocation that decided there ought to be an update to the AV. And that was a big mistake and opened the door for deceiving men, servants of the devil, to get in. This will become clear perhaps as I give you this information, but abundantly clear if you read the book. Opened the door for unbelieving men to get in and attack the King James Bible. One of the men appointed to the committee was a Unitarian. He didn't believe in the deity of the Lord Jesus Christ. There was outcry about that, him being on the committee, but the two leading men, Westcott and Hort, said if he's not on it, we're not on it. The Church of England had any sense, they said, good, you go as well, but sadly they didn't. So the Revised Version came out in 1881, I think in the earlier part of the year, the New Testament that is, and John Burgon replied in articles in a publication called the Quarterly Review in October of 1881. I think he published 3 replies, and those 3 articles or replies he puts together in the book, which is called The Revision Revised. And so what I'll do is I'll tell you what those 3 replies or those 3 articles are about. I'll give you a little bit of information about each one. The first response was with concern to the new Greek text that Westcott and Hort adopted, a Greek text which they had prepared 10 years before and which they had secretly placed in the hands of all the revisers before they sat down to revise. So the dice were loaded from day one. So Burgon addresses the new Greek text of Westcott and Hort in his first section, which is about 110 pages or so. And then he addresses in his second article, in the second portion or the second section of the book, the New English Version, which was called the Revised Version. The New Testament came out in 1881 and the Old Testament followed in 1885. And Burgon addresses that in the second section of this book. The third section that Burgon deals with was Westcott and Hort's new textual theory, and at the end of that was a vindication of the King James Bible reading at 1 Timothy 3:16, which all you keen King James Bible people will know says God was manifest in the flesh, and the word God was removed by Westcott and Hort's Greek text, both from their Greek text and from the resulting Revised Version, and has been removed in almost every Bible ever since. And Burgon deals with that. I'll say more about that later. So the first section, the New Greek Text, that was answered in this quarterly review. I believe it was published, would you believe, or there were letters at least in the Guardian newspaper, which is a well left-wing newspaper these days, but there were at least replies to Burgon in the Guardian at the time. But the first article was the New Greek Text, the second, the New English Version, the Revised Version, and the third, Burgon's response to Westcott and Hort's new theory of textual criticism. So we'll take the sections one at a time, and what I've done is I've just noted some of the chapter headings and the section headings that Burgon gives to try and give you a flavour and an idea of what you will find if you decide you want to read this book. Now, there is some Greek in the book. My Greek is pretty poor. I'd probably put myself about second year Greek, but second year schoolboy Greek at best. But I was, with that level of Greek, I was able to follow all his arguments. How easy the book will be to read if you didn't know any Greek, I can't say. Maybe much of it would still be fairly easy to read. What I like about the book is Burgon was a very clear thinker. He'd mastered the documents for sure, and they were really up against it. When he replied. So the New Greek Text, the first section, some of the headings he has. The reconstruction of the Greek text, he says, was a fatal mistake. The oldest copies of the New Testament, B and Aleph as they're called, the oldest manuscripts, which are among the most depraved extant, are just now blindly followed. He enlarges on these just headings. He will enlarge upon each of these. Westcott and Hort's printed Greek text, the most vicious which has hitherto appeared. Then follows a discussion by Burgon of the kinds of variations that happen in Greek manuscripts, such as accident, design, assimilation, mutilation, omission, transposition of words. There's another book of his called The Causes of Corruption, in which he goes into details and all those. Brilliant piece of work, but you need more Greek for that. And there is also a brief discussion in this first section, a short one, of the text that's been amended in the modern Bibles, 1 Timothy 3:16, God was manifest in the flesh. And then, having in this first section examined and condemned many changes, the Dean says at page 106, quote, the foregoing are examples only of about 6,000 departures from the traditional text. And so we come then in round about page 113 to the second section, which is a discussion of a New English Version, the Revised Version. And again, I'm just going to give you some of his chapter and paragraph headings. He says, quote, their one anxiety, speaking of the Revised Version revisers, their one anxiety seems to have been to impose Westcott and Hort's vicious recension or revision on the public. He goes on to speak that the proof that the rules laid down at the outset by the Church of England for the revision of the AV and of the underlying Greek text have been disregarded. So the Southern Convocation of the Church of England had given a number of rules by which the revisers were to work when they created the Revised Version, and Burgon proves that those rules were disregarded. One of Burgon's contemporaries, Canon Cook, who was at the time the Bishop of Exeter, who also did a response to the Revised Version and mentions Burgon, also says that they shamefully disregarded the rules that they were given for the translation. It was a satanic work. It was a dirty piece of work from start to finish. Burgon also then in this section complains of the English saying mechanical uniformity of rendering, a grievous mistake. In other words, they would kind of insistent that a Greek word must always be represented by the same English word. This was not something that the AV translators did in 1611, and they speak about it, I believe, in the translators to the reader. Both Burgon, I think, and Canon Cook refer to this pedantic, failing to grasp the English idioms. I think it might be in the Revision Revised. Burgon says that the AV translators were not only masters of Greek and Hebrew and other ancient languages, they were masters of English, and they certainly were. And he goes on to say in this respect that they violated the proprieties of the English language. The case of the revision, he says, is hopeless. The third section in Burgon's book, The Revision Revised, which we're looking at together, is an examination of Westcott and Hort's new theory of textual criticism. And Burgon analyses the method of their predecessors, men called Lachmann, Tregelles and Tischendorf, and points out what had been the underlying fallacy of them all. Before Lachmann, Burgon doesn't mention this here, was a man called Griesbach, who was a German, and he was pretty wild. In fact, Lachmann was even more wild in rejecting the bulk of the information to construct his Greek text. Burgon, in this section on the textual theory, examines Hort's principles of what he calls manuscript genealogy and theory of conflation and explodes them. Hort invented some imaginary councils in the church going way back in order to validate his dates, his new dates, with regard to his conflicting texts, and those councils that he speaks of have no place in history. He made them up to favour his views. And then again, Burgon writes, Dr. Hort is for shutting us up forever within codices B and Aleph, but we decline to submit to the proposed bondage, for the bad character of these two codices is a fact. Their very preservation being probably attributable solely to the patent foulness of the text they exhibit. And Burgon had seen, he had been to the Vatican, and he had been given permission to have a look at Vatican Manuscript B. And then Burgon gives in this third section an imaginary dialogue to show that the most ancient document accessible is not of necessity the purest also. You will find in many modern Bibles a footnote saying the most ancient manuscripts say, but of course if you read 1 Thessalonians, you read 2 Corinthians, you will learn that forgeries were being made while Paul was still alive. So antiquity, as John Trapp said in one place, antiquity without verity is no better than conspiracy. And Burgon argues in this imaginary dialogue, and he makes it clear that it's an imaginary dialogue, that the most ancient document accessible is not of necessity the purest also. Of Hort's method of textual criticism, Burgon then says, by adopting his preposterous method, the revisers have done their best to make the Church of England, as well as themselves, ridiculous. After the third section then follows a reply to a Church of England bishop who defended the work of Westcott and Hort. And then following that, 76 pages Burgon spends in the Revision Revised defending God was manifest in the flesh in 1 Timothy 3:16 against that bishop and against Westcott and Hort. Again, I will just say, I will quote another of Burgon's contemporaries later, but Burgon's learning was profound. He took them out to the woodshed in no uncertain terms. Now, in his concluding pages, Burgon expresses the view that the revised version will fail. And as such, it did. I believe it was largely ignored, with some exceptions, pretty soon after 1900. It soon fell into disuse, and the AV continued to be used until the NIV came on the scene, or perhaps the RV a little before that. The AV came on the NIV came on the scene, I think it may have been 1971, and the revised version a little before that, and these follow the text of Westcott and Hort. Once Burgon was dead, the enemy came back, and now almost all modern Bibles follow Westcott and Hort in both the Greek and the English. Not verbatim, of course, otherwise they couldn't get a copyright. But the changes are based on the Westcott and Hort Greek text. Although some deny it, it's patently the fact, and you can find this if you're into Greek, you can find this from St. Nestle Allen's 28th edition. The devil only departs for a season. When men forget what has been said before, when men forget the victories of the past, Satan just comes back and says the same old lies again. And the church today is falling for the lies that it is always fallen for. There have been times, I dare say in England in the 1600s, I know in the 1500s and certainly in the 1600s, there was great godliness amongst the men in England, the Puritans, Church of England men. And many of the errors of Satan will have been overthrown. But once those men are dead, Satan just says the same thing again, and the youngsters take it all up. I had meant to say at the outset that at the time that Burgon wrote, there was great learning among the Victorian Anglicans, alongside, regrettably, a conspiratorial move back to Rome and German rationalism. Burgon fought against the rationalism too, and he was mocked, and he used to preach at Christ Church College, Oxford, I believe it was, and I have a couple of his messages on inspiration. And he withstood the great book at the time, Essays and Reviews, which was full of all sorts of unbelieving gibberish. But there was not only Burgon, there were other terrific learned men in the Anglican Church. As for their godliness, I cannot speak. But I think, for example, of Canon Cook, who knew something about manuscript evidence and biblical criticism or textual criticism, who was also an editor of a C of E series of commentaries. I have a book in my library. I'll just need to pick it off the shelf to get his name right. And it's called The Doctrine of the Greek Article Applied to the Criticism and Illustration of the New Testament by Thomas F. Middleton and Hugh J. Rose. And I couldn't get very far with that book because it was so full of Latin and Greek. But again, it really is an extraordinary piece of learning and a useful book in some places in defending the proper use of the definite article. But we're not talking about Thomas Middleton today. But I'd say that to say the learning was considerable. And Burgon was at the forefront. Now, I've mentioned already one of those learned and godly men was Frederick Cook, Canon of Exeter, and he wrote a response to the Revised Version himself, and in the opening page of that he wrote concerning Burgon's articles in the Quarterly Review in October 1881. He says, in an article which for profound learning, and especially for all documents on which the decision of disputed questions in the criticism of the New Testament depends, is entitled to a foremost place in theological literature of the present age. Another man, a learned man of the time, was Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener. He was a vicar of Hendon. Burgon rated him highly as a textual critic, and he wrote of Burgon's defence of the last 12 verses of Mark, which I might review before too long, that it was very, very powerful. I don't remember quite his words, but pretty much a masterpiece, which it was, and was all I needed to read to satisfy me for the last 45 years that the last 12 verses of Mark are authentic as they are found in the King James Bible. So, the Revision Revised Dean John William Burgon is a must. If you're going to look at textual criticism, it is a must. And it helps if you know some Greek. It really would help if you're in pastoral ministry or an elder. I think so anyway. But this book, I think I read it 40 to 45 years ago, and it was all I needed. It convinced me thoroughly and completely and absolutely. And neither James White nor the gentle and agreeable Wes Huff can overthrow the things that I learned back then. I have a lot of problems with James White's responses. Wes Huff is a much more agreeable Christian, it seems to me, and a lovable brother. But I watched an interview with Wes Huff recently where some men who wanted to brand King James Version only as a cult were trying to get Wes Huff on their side, and he was on their side regrettably. But what nearly had me fall off my chair was while they were interviewing Wes Huff. And as I say, I love the brother. I think he's a great blessing to the church, except for his views on the King James Bible. When they asked him, had he heard of John Burgon, he didn't. He had never heard of him, which just shows how one-sided textual criticism teaching is in the colleges and universities. So, as I say, Burgon was all I needed 45 years ago, and I would suggest to you, especially if you know a little bit of Greek, read the Revision Revised, and nobody will shoot you down. I've read James White's book. Everybody recommends James White's book. If you're familiar with Burgon, James White's a walk in the park. But his attitude is very disagreeable, unlike Wes Huff. Thank God, at least Wes Huff has a good attitude, and I appreciate much of his work. So there we are, the Revision Revised, Dean John William Burgon, one of the greatest books on the subject you can get, and I advise you, if you want to defend the AV, to read it. It might even be worth, learning Greek, if God will give you that liberty to read this book. It is so good. So there we are. Thank you for your time and patience. The Lord bless. And I might do some more Burgon, especially on the last 12 verses of Mark, before much longer. God bless now. Bye-bye.